Shaazia is the Digital and Communications Specialist at the Climate Justice Coalition, and she previously ran an activist media incubator at the Accountability Lab. She holds an MA in Transnational Queer Feminist Politics from SOAS in the University of London, and her dissertation entitled Towards Queer Utopia, Building and Sustaining Feminist Revolution in South Africa was awarded with distinction and received the Centre for Gender Studies Dissertation Innovation Award. In a previous life, Shaazia was a journalist at the Daily Vox. I really enjoyed meeting Shaazia when we were talking about how she might contribute to this conference. So without a further ado, over to you, Shaazia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Judith. I really appreciate it. And let me say good morning, good evening, hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. As Judith said, my name is Shaazia and I work for the Climate Justice Coalition. Let me actually share my presentation before I start speaking. There we go. I hope you can see it. So, yeah. So the Climate Justice Coalition is an amalgamation of 50 trade unions, youth organizations, grassroots organizations, community-based groups, faith-based groups, and independent activists, as well as international and local non-governmental organizations. So I originally prepared this presentation with my colleague Mbali Baduza, but she was unable to present with me today. We initially presented parts of this presentation to the hybrid symposium on community psychology and climate justice, which was hosted at the University of Johannesburg in June 2023. Today, I've been invited to respond to Sally Weintrobe's incredible presentation in another gathering of the psychologist community. So thank you so much, Judith, and the team at PsyFuture for having me today. Of course, I'm not a psychologist. I don't belong to your community, but I hope that my presentation can perhaps help you think through, I guess, the discipline as it's emerging, think through the work that you do, and also have a little bit of a window into how activists feel as we do the work. I was very sort of inspired by Sally's presentation and also just learning about the discipline as a whole. It was very new to me to hear that climate psychology was a thing in this world. Oftentimes we feel so alienated as activists and we feel like there's not much support for us. So it's good to know that there are communities like this around the world who are doing this kind of work. I was particularly inspired by the way Sally mentioned the way she thinks about how we can't look at the mind individually and without context. And also the way that power struggles and injustice is very much central in the way we think about things. You know, like we can't think about climate without thinking about decolonization, without thinking about racism, without thinking about the divide between the global South and the global North. But perhaps I'll just go into my presentation and we can think about these things together. So let me begin by saying that we must address the deep traumas faced by those who are fighting in our social movements. When we fail to care for and acknowledge them and their trauma, we risk the burnout of activists themselves and the movement as a whole. The climate justice movement is no different. At the Climate Justice Coalition, we share a common goal. We want to push forward a transformative climate justice agenda which works to overcome the deep inequality, poverty, and multiple injustices that South Africa faces. As it says on our T-shirts, system change, not climate change. Given the vibrant and diverse membership of the CJC, we have witnessed firsthand how trauma can manifest and affect our members. In this presentation, we'd like to explore the concept of institutional betrayal as a traumatic stressor for climate activists. We'd also like to explore the ways in which we can try to create social movements which seek to understand and respond to this trauma. We first encountered the concept of institutional betrayal from one of your colleagues, Dr. Garrett Barnwell, who submitted an expert report for the cancel coal litigation in South Africa. He explained that when communities are dependent on the government to meet their needs, including health and safety, and the government continues to perpetuate harm, this can create a breach of trust and contribute to secondary trauma. This concept so accurately captures the experience of activists and is the reason why we became activists in the first place. We'd like to highlight the following. Firstly, the voices of young Black climate justice activists who are queer and/or women, and reflect on how the current government in South Africa, which was once a party of liberation, has betrayed present and future generations, and how this form of betrayal invokes feelings of loss and hopelessness. We spoke to some of our members to get their perspectives on institutional betrayal. And our member, Farron Pedro, says, the breaking point for me was the Marikana massacre, where 34 mine workers were killed by the state for protesting for higher wages and better working conditions. A state that was meant to protect them, instead protecting the interests of mining capital with violence. I realized they're not and will never be on our side. If the choice is between the bosses and the workers, the rich and the poor, they would not only choose the former, they would kill us if we threaten their interests. Secondly, we give two examples of how systemic institutional betrayal is experienced through A, state trade-offs on minimum emission standards, which have major public health implications, and B, a severely underfunded mental health budget, which in the age of austerity has seen decrease in real terms, despite the persistent onslaught of climate impacts and the known impacts on mental health and well-being. For climate activists in a society characterized as the most unequal country in the world, we are confronted daily by primary and secondary accounts of traumatic stresses. We also know that trauma is not dispersed equally, with Black and non-Black people of color, women and queer climate activists shouldering a greater trauma load. Many of the people who are part of our movements face multiple oppressions. Often they come from poor and underserved communities. They don't necessarily have the resources to deal with their trauma. These are the activists whose voices we'd like to amplify. And I also appreciated, as Judith mentioned, I was actually at the presentation this morning, and the presenter, John Jameer Benson Aruta, I'm probably butchering his name, spoke to the intersectionality of climate justice movement. So I'm happy that I can kind of continue that conversation. Anyway, as activists, we've seen that trauma is not just a male experience equipped to heal the trauma of those within our movements. We are called upon to create climate justice movements that are caring and provide spaces for healing. We can change the way that we conceptualize the movement to decrease the harm that activists face. Now, I don't want to be talking about trauma to a group of psychologists, but this is how we think about the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. We see how they manifest in our movements. We activists are angry. We fight, we battle, we weaponize. In terms of flight, We are constantly in motion. We don't take breaks because oppression is nonstop. We glorify overwork. And we fawn over those who are willing to give themselves up for the movement, putting the issue ahead of the individual, even when doing so jeopardizes that individual's well-being. Trauma continues to build, and sometimes our movements look like the very systems we are trying to reform. We are hurting, we hurt each other. We become jaded, we burn out, we leave, we fight amongst each other, we are complacent. We don't want this to happen in our movements. We want to draw on the bodies of work by critical race theorists, intersectional feminists, to suffuse the movement with radical care, with kinship, with rest and pleasure. We believe that in this context, we can play a crucial role in supporting the movement and advocating for the mental well-being of activists. When we look at radical care, we ask, what does it mean to have a social movement focused on care? Care work recognizes the interdependence of humans. It is slow and it focuses on meaningful relations of the everyday. This is what makes it sustainable. Care can consider thinking about and with others to allow for a collective political sense of what it means to live with each other. Care is based in solidarity. Kinship and community. A more holistic way to create change is to focus simultaneously on the individual and the collective. As Adrienne Maree Brown writes, healing and meaningful change emerges from being kindred. To be kindred means to be connected to the self and to others, but also to be part of broader systems with other organisms. Rest. When will we romanticize rest? Capitalism works all of us to the bone. For Black women and also other women of color, capitalism works us to near exhaustion. Our social movements cannot romanticize overwork if we are to be the antithesis to capitalism. Actively focusing on rest will improve the quality of life of activists, allowing them to make more space for themselves and the movements. Pleasure. Audre Lorde's life-altering essay, The Uses of the Erotic, rooted in Lorde's life-altering essay, The Uses of the Erotic, Adrienne Maree Brown explains pleasure activism as learning what brings us pleasure and incorporating this into the movement for justice and liberation. In South Africa, when we protest, we sing. And I do believe that that helps us connect with each other and connect with pleasure. I mean, this is rooted in the understanding that pleasure is often encumbered by oppression, and reclaiming pleasure is liberatory work. Finding pleasure within and as an act of liberation is an important idea for people in South Africa, and I'm sure the world. Witnessing the struggle for climate justice is not only a responsibility, but a fight for everyone's future. We believe that armchair practice in psychology in the context of the climate emergency will do little to enable good mental health for activists. We must be in community with activists living with trauma, supporting their healing journey, and we must strive to support the movement in a way that is mutually beneficial for the healers and the wounded. We asked some of our members what they think, what kind of support they think they might need, and this is what they said. So Gabriel, and that's Gabriel with the hair and the mic there. Gabriel said, listen to us. Young people don't want to be fighting for our futures. Many have said Gen Z will be the last generation to experience trauma because we will either be united intergenerationally and won the fight, or we will all perish. We need access to support structures that we won't find in our communities. We need those people before us to help guide and support us as we continue the fight. We don't need them to continue to dictate what they think we know. We need to acknowledge the fact that when it comes, it's the space that you exist in all the different elements. Climate change affects all those spaces. Any practitioner needs to take into account climate justice or climate change so that they can properly diagnose and support the person asking for support. He says a whole lot more things, and I would encourage you to listen to a podcast that we recorded, but I'll put that on the screen a little later. So Farron says, I don't think we even notice the way in which the climate crisis affects us. It's like we're lobsters in boiling water and someone's raised the temperature slowly, so we don't recognize we're burning. We just feel miserable and tired and angry and stressed and terminally anxious. I'm no expert, but I could use one. The biggest problem we face is the lack of access to that care, but also the atomized way in which we look at our lives. I would love it if therapists were more aware of the ways in which systems affect people and how people fighting for systemic change are really burdened emotionally and physically by that fight and the fear that things could never get better and it's their fault. So here's the episode where you can listen to justice movement. But lastly, Mbali says, and I don't have a slide for her, but she says, I think psychologists can support climate justice activists, climate justice. After all, it's a fight for everyone, and context is everything. Where experience is the best teacher for understanding, you have to understand who you're talking to meet people where they at. This morning, I saw a question in the chat, and someone asked, what can psychologists say as a body of organized psychologists about the effect of climate change on people and on activists? And I've been thinking about that the whole day. And I think as someone who works in communications, I would be so happy to work with psychologists about certain campaigns we're advocating for. So if we're saying cancel coal, it would be so interesting to get a psychologist to speak to the effects of coal mining communities, what it's like on the psyche for someone to live in a coal mining community. That can form part of our advocacy, for example. That's just something I was thinking about. But let me conclude. I've taken up a lot of time. I'll conclude by saying, let us remember that without acknowledging and addressing the deep traumas faced by those fighting in our social movements, not only do we risk the individual burnout of our activists, we also risk the collapse of the movement as a whole. As psychologists, academics, and civil society members, we have the responsibility to take action. Let us be allies and witnesses to the struggle for climate justice. Let us explore radical care, build strong communities, and support a movement that promotes healing, justice, and lasting change. Thank you.
Shaazia, I would like us, if we can, to unmute, please, and applaud, because I feel we need to do something just to register.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So in the same way